So there's only a couple more things left to do before we start hooking this up to our bind rig. We need to finish up with the pole vector, and then we need to deal with the fact that our control rig and our bind rig don't really line up. Before we set up our pole vector, first let's talk about what we want to do with it. Normally when you move the foot, you want that pole vector to move with it. See how the leg is twisting? Without the pole vector moving it, we're going to have to constantly counter animate. The other thing we need to do is we want the pole vector to rotate in this direction with the IK handle, but not front or back or side to side. If it rotates front or back and he raises it up, we could inadvertently shove the pole vector behind the leg, and that'll cause it to flip. But before we can get the pole vector to move with the IK controller, we need to make sure that it's got the right rotation order. Now as you see here, the rotate order is XYZ. What that means is X is last to evaluate. And you can illustrate this fairly easily by setting this to gimbal mode. Now what's going to happen is, as I rotate Z, all three axes come along for the ride. As I rotate Y, Z does not move. And then if I rotate X, X moves by itself. Rotations happen in a specific order, and you can imagine it as your X rotation is a child of your Y rotation, which is a child of your Z rotation. So changing the rotate order will have the effect of changing the parents if they were each individual objects. So what we want is a rotate order where the foot can spin in this direction without gimbaling. You see how the Z and the X are lining up? So there's no way I can rotate in this direction right now. We need to find a rotate order that will allow the foot to rotate in Y and not gimbal. You can't really avoid gimbal lock altogether, but you can definitely minimize it if you pick a rotate order that is going to work best for what that particular object has to do. In this case, it's less likely that the foot's going to rotate all the way around in X or in Z, but the character is expected to be able to turn 180 degrees. People can walk around in circles after all. So what we want is for something like ZXY. So now as we rotate in Y, all the other rotations come with it. And we can still rotate in X. And we're not overly worried about Z. Z is probably the least amount of rotation that we're going to have. So ZXY should work. You'll notice that this one is just floating out here. So again, we're going to go to our handy 0 node script. So each one has a parent, and so now their local transformations are zeroed out. The pole vector control, rotation, scale doesn't really affect it because it's basically the point where the IK handle is aiming towards. So we can lock off all the rotations and scales. Lock and hide those. And again, visibility we will make non-keyable. How do we get this to follow this in all translations and only the Y rotation? A simple parent constraint will get the translations, but the rotations become a bit trickier. The easiest way to get this to really work well is just create an empty null, and we'll make that the parent. Control parent. We'll take that. Take that. And we'll parent constrain that. We'll take the offset off and constrain only in the Y. And the other thing we need to do is make sure that its rotational order is the same. It doesn't help us if the foot control isn't gimbaling, but the thing driving the pole vector constraint is. So we should have the parent and the control have the same rotate order. Now we'll simply take that, parent it to that, and we'll put that all under the floor plane. So now, as I move this in IK, the pole vector moves with, and if I rotate it in Y, it comes along with for the ride, but not if I do X or Z. Okay, it's doing a little bit in Z, but you get the idea. And that sets up our pole vector constraint. Basically, our keyframe rig for the leg is, for the most part, done. However, if you unhide this, that's our mocap rig. Here, that's our bind rig. Now you'll notice we're going to have a small problem. We have an extra joint here in the leg. And we also have the roll joints. The roll joints are a separate problem. That's a minor issue. This extra joint here in the knee is going to cause us problems because we didn't put in the mocap rig because the human IK stuff for mocap doesn't know what to do with that extra joint in the knee. The keyframe rig we could have built with the extra joint in there and it would have understood it. It's the mocap that's going to trip us up. Luckily these joints are built pretty straight and that'll allow us to do a little bit of a trick to get everything to work. What I need to do is I need to have a copy of that joint chain to be driven by the keyframe rig. Switch to show selected, auto load selected objects. Okay, so we have the mocap rig, which is just spare skeletons, at least for now. We can put a human IK rig on this later. We have the keyframe rig. This is our FK, and that's the right, and that's the floor plane for our IK setup. And then of course we have the bind, and then I have these joints, which basically is a copy of the bind skeleton. Now you'll notice, if you can compare the two, the white is the bind, the green is the mocap. And while the mocap has a single joint here, the bind has two joints. The bind also has an extra joint here and here for roll joints, but that's a minor problem. That'll actually correct itself fairly simple. It's this splitting of the knee that's going to cause us problems because as of the time of this recording, human IK really cannot handle this double knee. It just doesn't know what really to do with it properly. With that said, the keyframe rig has no problem with it. We could have built a keyframe rig with both these joints in there, would have been fine. But getting back and forth to mocap would have caused a bit of a problem. As an example, if you had cloud data and you were trying to map it to an actor in Motion Builder, it just wouldn't have a representation for that joint. So how do we get all this rectified? How do we have basically a 2-bone setup for both the keyframe and the mocap to drive the 3-bone setup? What I'm going to do first is I'm going to rename all these. Actually, I'm going to need a second copy of those, so I'm just going to duplicate that. And for the first set, I'm just going to rename it as KF for keyframe driver. And again, the only reason why we have to go through and do this, I'm just going to talk as we don't need the roll joint for our driver, so I'm going to take that out. As I was saying, the only reason why we have to do it this way is because we want to make this friendly for mocap, and that gives us some limitations. If this was a keyframe only rig, we wouldn't need to do this. We can just build the keyframe rig with the extra joint and everything would be fine. And again, we don't need the shin roll joint. We'll handle roll joints differently. And we really don't need that in joint. Just delete that. Okay. That's enough for now. You get the idea. I'll go through and rename all these other joints and everything later. What we're going to do eventually is do the same thing for mocap. You have this other chain here. We'll rename that as mocap driver. But for now, we'll just hide them. We'll get to that part later. And for now, we will hide the mocap skeleton. We'll get to that part later. So right now, we're just going to focus on the and keyframe drivers. So why are we not driving the bind directly? Again, it has to do with being able to switch back and forth between the keyframe rig and the mocap rig. If we were just doing a keyframe rig or just doing a mocap rig, there'd be a whole level of complexity that we could pull out of this and make it a lot simpler. Eventually we'll be able to set it up to where we can bring in the mocap, transfer it to the keyframe rig, do whatever we want, transfer it back to the mocap, and the whole thing be completely AC/DC. So in order for this to drive this, the easiest way is to simply create an IK system. RP, and that means I'm going to have another pole vector marker, and that's fine. So here to here, I'm going to create a null. We'll call this the pole vector IK switch marker. And if you have followed my 3D World tutorials on IKFK switching, you'll understand what that's going to be used for, and you'll already have an idea of what's going to happen here. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to use this to snap the translations, and I'm going to put the pole vector switch marker as a child of that thigh joint. And again, why it goes there, follow the tutorials from the 3D World article, issue 141, where I talk about IKFK switching. I'm not going to go into detail here because it's a little redundant. So select that, select the IK switch marker, which we'll need for IKFK switching anyway, so we'll just have that do double duty. Select that there, constrain pole vector marker. So now it should stick. Oops, no, because this one actually isn't going anywhere yet. Put it right there. And I'm just going to lock that for now, just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So now that should work. There we go, that's better. So now you can see, and you're going to have separation here because obviously that can't match it. There's a gap here, but it's staying in the same plane. So this is what our bind rig would be doing if we were manipulating directly on the bind. So what about these other ones? Real simple orientate constraint fixes that problem right up. When you're doing an IK system, and again, this was covered in the 3D World article, the videos are up on the Spectral Inc. YouTube channel page as a playlist, so feel free to go through them. But short answer is an IK system will lock the middle joint and all but the bend axis. So even though I have the, and you can see it here, if you turn IK on, this joint's only bending in Y. And if I swing that around, this joint is also bending in Y. Well, now we have an IK system underneath that. And so the same rules apply. So even though we can turn IK off and rotate this in any way we want in FK, the IK underneath it can't match it. So one thing that I can do to prevent animators from tripping on that and having issues is lock the X and the Z. Now you may have remembered that there is a roll joint here. We will drive the roll joint by the rotation of the ankle, and it's going to be the same way that we're going to drive the rotation of the wrist via the hand. So we'll cover that in a bit. But this leg is pretty much ready to go. The only thing we need to do now is do the same thing for the mocap side, connect them to the bind, and then handle the two roll joints.